Today, India is the most populous country in the world with a skyrocketing GDP. But if you look at GDP per capita, India is way down on the list. I don't think I need to tell anyone that India has serious challenges to overcome. But what would happen if India was never colonized by Britain? How would India be different? This is what, why, how, and that's what the video is about. If you like this sort of thing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for early access to future videos. So let's rewind back in time to 1498 when the first sailors of Portugal arrived on the shores of India. When asked by the locals of Calicut what they were doing there, a sailor allegedly answered, "We came to seek Christians and spices." We've all heard the story of Western European merchants going to Asia to outflank Italian and Ottoman control of the spice trade. But India also had finished goods like cotton textiles, which the Europeans purchased a lot. The fact that India was manufacturing cotton textiles shows that just because European merchants were there does not mean Europe was more advanced than India, at least in the 1500s. In fact, India continued to be an equal power to Europe through the 1600s. This was not a backwater. European sources at the time recognized Indian guns were as good as, if not superior to, European guns. India even had some more advanced technologies like rockets, which the British borrowed. Unlike the conquest of America, the Europeans didn't sweep over India all at once. Undoubtedly, they would have liked to, but throughout the 1500s and the 1600s, they could only take control of coastal trade posts and fortresses. But gradually, the British East India Company gained more and more power. When the Mughal Empire that ruled India fell into a civil war in the early 1700s, the British really began to take control of inland territory. By about 1800, Britain's conquest of India was irreversible. Let's talk about British rule for a second. The British ruled over India all the way until 1947. Over these decades, there were some positives to British rule, including the construction of railroads and universities. These, of course, were not products of selflessness, but instead ways to strengthen the colonial regime. British rule was focused on the extraction of profit, not the legitimate and sustainable development of India. British neglect and outright cruelty caused the worst famine in Indian history in the late 1800s, with more than 10 million deaths. Oh, and remember the Indian textile industry? Britain crushed it to boost British manufacturers. These things might be avoidable in our alternate history scenario. But even if Britain never conquered India, India would not be guaranteed prosperity, in large part because it would still be sucked into the global economy. The fact of the matter is, world historical forces were at play here. India just was not going to outcompete Europe. Some point to environmental or geographical causes, others point to political or social institutions in Europe such as property rights and stronger political systems. The historian Prasannan Parthasarathi argues that Britain simply faced certain pressures, such as deforestation and India's own textiles, which drove British people to experiment with coal and new machines to make textiles. This was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. India just didn't have those pressures, and that's why it fell behind. Britain was going to be stronger than India, but Britain was stronger than plenty of other places, including China and Japan, which they were not strong enough to actually colonize. So what could have gone differently? Let's rewind to the late 1690s. Tensions are boiling between the British East India Company and Aurangzeb, the ruler of the Mughal Empire. In a major move, Aurangzeb stopped all English trade and ordered his local officers to seize all English trading missions and sieged Bombay. In the end, frantic negotiations and offers to pay reparations by the English ended the imbroglio. In fact, Aurangzeb butted heads with the East India Company several more times, but just never finished the job. Here's what the New Cambridge History says. Mughal failure to seize Bombay and Madras was a direct result of Aurangzeb's overwhelming preoccupation with the Maratha problem. The emperor was unwilling and increasingly unable to bring sufficient military weight to bear to occupy these ports. What was the Maratha problem? Well, the Marathas were a caste of aristocratic Hindu noblemen who rebelled against the Muslim lords of the Mughal Empire. While they rebelled for a bunch of different reasons, including cold power politics, one key reason was Aurangzeb's imposition of the jizya tax on non-Muslims. Shivaji, the first leader of the new Maratha kingdom, even specifically brought up this tax in a public letter to Aurangzeb. While later emperors abolished this tax, if Aurangzeb never imposed it, the Mughal Empire probably could have lasted longer. While the Marathas probably still would have rebelled, Aurangzeb's victory over them in 1689 might have lasted longer, giving him the breathing space he needed to wage a full campaign against the British East India Company and other European merchants and pirates. Now, all of Aurangzeb's successes were reversed in real life by the power struggles between a series of feuding, weak rulers that followed his death in 1707. But that was really a matter of bad luck. Had the Mughal Empire simply not been as unlucky as it was in real life, and one of Aurangzeb's sons inherited the throne for at least 10 years, then maybe the empire would not have fragmented apart as quickly as it did in real life. Okay, so let's say Aurangzeb is able to stamp out the British East India Company in the late 1600s. What happens next? Well, I think the most likely scenario is the Mughal Empire limps along for several more generations. But first, let's talk about something important. This is an intervention. I know for a fact lots of you are debating and arguing with people online well past midnight, and that's probably because the longer days and the later sunsets of the summer disrupt your natural sleep cycle. But sleep is very important, and that's where Manta Sleep comes in, the sponsor for today's video. If you stay up late but still want a full night's sleep or maybe an afternoon nap, the Manta Sleep Mask, which is the world's best sleep mask by the way, will help you block out sunlight. I'm a light sleeper and I can confirm this. And if you have a headache or puffy eyes, why not try out the cool eye cups for the Manta Sleep Mask? Not only are these sleep masks comfortable, they're adjustable and customizable. You can find a direct link below to mantasleep.com and use the code WWHOW to get 10% off your next order. That is WWHOW. Thanks to our point of divergence, the regional governors, with occasional help from the central government, can repel most European expansion. The Europeans continue to control trading posts. Britain and France are of course distracted by fighting each other elsewhere in several wars, including the American Revolution. But in the late 1700s, the Mughal Empire inevitably fragments apart. The two most powerful successors are the Maratha Empire, allied with Britain, and the Kingdom of Bengal, allied with France. When a revolution topples the government of France, Bengal loses a powerful ally, the Marathas crush them in the early 1800s, then soon afterwards sweep across southern India and unite the continent. While Britain hoped to divide and conquer India, they were too distracted by Napoleon to rein in the Marathas' conquest of the subcontinent. So by the early 1800s, India is reunified by a strong new empire. What happens next? Well, history could go in a lot of directions depending mostly on whether India successfully modernizes, like Japan, or fails to modernize, like China or the Ottoman Empire. What if India followed Japan's path? Well, the Maratha government could seek to emulate and copy the successes of Britain and France in order to strengthen India. This could come with political reforms and the adoption of a European-style government. The Marathas were already not the sort of absolute monarchy you might expect. That's why we call them the Maratha Confederacy. All the Marathas would need would be a series of reform-minded prime ministers to coordinate a self-strengthening program. Now, India is a massive country to govern, so it's going to be hard, but certain parts of India, as we already talked about, were pretty well off and advanced in the early 1600s. Bengal and southern India might just be centers of an Indian industrialization. Now, India just was not going to outpace Britain, but it might just get its first railroad built in the mid-1800s. From there, they just snowball. Now, this progressive, modernizing government would probably face domestic opposition to the reforms from the land-holding elite. In 1858, the Conservatives launch a major rebellion. If the Indian National Army, drilled and armed with modern rifles, succeeds, then India would be set up for national success. If the Conservatives win and reverse the reforms, India would stumble back onto the path of European conquest and destruction. For the sake of the video, let's say the reformists win and keep power. By the late 1800s, India would be a great power, even if Europeans refused to recognize that. A decisive moment comes in the 1870s. After decades of increasing tension with Britain over its expansion in Sri Lanka and Burma, India launches a surprise attack against Britain. With Britain distracted by fighting Russia elsewhere, the war is fought to a stalemate. Britain keeps Sri Lanka, but the two powers split control of Burma, so it's a stalemate. India has proven itself on the world stage to be a great power. Thanks to their rivalry with Britain, India grows closer and closer to Germany. The Indian government adopts a German-style regime and imports nationalism, gradually whittling away at regional differences to promote a single Indian national identity and culture, of course centered on the Marathi people. Tensions between Germany and other European powers erupt into a world war in 1907. Thanks to the Indo-German alliance, India leaps into the war and crushes the last European ports on the subcontinent, then throws the British out of Burma and imposes Indian rule. India even launches an ambitious campaign into Persia to throw out the Russians. Even though India suffers heavy losses, Russia collapses sooner, so India is able to put puppets in charge of Persia and Afghanistan and even lands marines in Oman. Britain and France lose the war, with Germany becoming the master of Europe. While India is the unchallenged ruler of South Asia, its massive expenditures and nationalist policies have overextended the federal government. Workers demand political power, while the many different cultural groups across the country demand greater rights and recognition. When the global economy collapses in 1934, India shatters into a civil war. From there, India can go in a lot of different directions. Here's one path. This Indian civil war would probably continue for several years as no power is able to cement control of the entire subcontinent. This is a warlord era. Britain or Germany might just occupy key areas and rule through puppets. But the tide changes when a new universalist movement vaults onto the scene, the Indian Communist Party. The communists seize control of urban factories, granting them the advantage they need to become the most powerful faction in the Civil War by 1940. Years of fighting follow, during which many people die, but by the late 1950s, India has been reunified as a People's Republic. On the international stage, India would ally itself with other communist countries, wherever they might be. The United States and its European allies would in turn be India's rivals for power. But India would probably be mostly focused on domestic issues. State police establish massive prisons in the deserts of the West. The government hijacks and redirects regional nationalist movements against internal minority populations. For example, Muslims in non-Muslim areas are deported to the West and the Northeast. Hindus in those areas are kicked out too. This causes immense suffering and bloodshed. Meanwhile, India begins an agricultural collectivization program. This is hugely disruptive and causes a gigantic famine, wiping out millions of peasants. But by the 1980s, a new generation of Indian technocrats have come to power who watched their parents get thrown into prison or their communities destroyed. They pass a series of reforms that restrict government control over the people and the economy. But this lets the genie out of the bottle. India's peripheral provinces declare independence in a national reawakening. Let's fast forward to 2025. The largest country there is the People's Republic of India. India still has massive advantages, including its gigantic population. With new government-directed state capitalist policies, India suppresses poverty and becomes a manufacturing hub of cheap goods. This fuels India's rise to be an economic powerhouse, and maybe eventually the center of the world again. To the south is Maratha, the old core of the Maratha Empire. Mumbai is the Asian capital of finance, but most people in this country work in agriculture. Then to the east is Bangla, which has recently gone through a religious reawakening. In fact, religious conflict is growing increasingly common across the subcontinent, with Sikhs fighting Muslims in Punjab, Hindus fighting Muslims in Sindh, and out west, Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims fighting each other in North and South Burma, which are more often in civil war than not. Now this is just one scenario, there's a million different possibilities. What do you think would happen? Comment below to let me know, and if you like this sort of thing, why not check out patreon.com/whatwhyhow for early access to future videos. Thanks to those who already support, and adios.